Hey everyone, welcome to the Annie Tunes In podcast. Today's episode is with Helen Taylor. Helen is the vice president of a company called Exodus Cry, whose mission is to end sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. We get into a lot of topics. If any of these are triggering, please make sure to be aware. And I also really wanted to raise awareness for these subjects that are not talked about enough, but are now getting more and more out in the public. So I just really want to make sure that we are focused and we get a lot of information that is very important that we can spread in the world today. So enjoy. So the first thing I want to talk about, I really want to raise awareness to these subjects that you discussed. That's kind of the main purpose of this, is just to bring awareness to the public and have them understand more of the ideas behind everything that you do. But first, tell us a little bit about what you do for people that are not aware.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Helen Taylor, and my title is the Vice President of Impact at Exodus Cry. And we're a national, but we do work internationally as well, anti-sex trafficking organization. There's a lot of different types of human trafficking, and we focus exclusively on sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. And yeah, I was our director of outreach for several years over all our programs where we do outreach to women who are impacted by sex trafficking, and we also offer trauma therapy for survivors. But I'd say the primary focus of the organization is really prevention, looking at the issues upstream. How do we change the laws? How do we shift the culture to prevent sex trafficking so that this problem doesn't just increase? So we make films and documentaries and do awareness campaigns as well. And that kind of ties into and influences the policy work that we advocate for as well.
It's amazing what you're doing. I think it's so cool. And I heard you say prevention, and that's one thing that I kind of want to talk about, because I think people focus on it after it's happened, and you hear stories and you're like, oh my gosh, this happened, and people will never think it happens to them. But when you talk about prevention, what are some ways that we can prevent this from happening?
Yeah, I think prevention to me in its simplest form is like two-pronged of identifying who are the most vulnerable groups, vulnerable to sex trafficking. And honestly, nowadays, anyone with a Wi-Fi connection, anyone with a device is vulnerable to being approached and groomed, even online, by a human trafficker. But who are the populations that are most at risk, and how do we do better education in those populations? Obviously, this is a global issue, and so how we do prevention in America might look different to Eastern Europe, to Asia. And so I'm speaking with the American focused perspective, but a lot of this applies to the world as well. So it's reducing the vulnerabilities of the most vulnerable populations to trafficking, and then addressing demand. It's a simplistic but I think helpful framework to understand that if men stopped purchasing women and children in the sex trade today, sex trafficking would end today. And I know that isn't going to happen overnight, and that's a process. But what are the most helpful policies and culture shifting mindsets in order to get closer to that? And the London School of Economics did the biggest study on this on 150 different countries. And they saw that wherever you legalize or fully decriminalize prostitution, basically making it fully legal for sex buyers to purchase people in the sex trade, you increase trafficking. Because if you increase demand and it becomes a normal part of the culture, therefore there's never enough willing individuals entering prostitution. And so that's where trafficking comes in. Women and children are sex trafficked into prostitution. They're not two separate things. They're very much the same pipeline. Obviously, anyone under the age of 18 in prostitution is legally immediately classified as a trafficking victim. If they're over 18, an element of force, fraud, or coercion has to take place for them to be classified as a trafficking victim. In my own experience, the vast majority of people in prostitution worldwide would come under those categories. So demand is changing the laws, making it a violent crime, a felony level offense to purchase sex, not just a slap on the wrist. And the countries that have been really effective in implementing this law are several, which I'd love to talk about. But the other thing that we give the analogy of a tree, which I think is a helpful analogy. So if you picture my arm as a tree, each individual fruit represents a trafficking victim. And so if you rescue 20 victims off a tree, or even cut off a whole branch and arrest a human trafficker while the trunk and the roots are still in place, you're not going to actually stop this tree from existing, this tree of exploitation. The trunk is a commercial sex industry that women and children are trafficked into, and the roots of demand which thrive in a pornographic soil. And so every sex buyer that we've interviewed was exposed to pornography as a child, and that began a pornography addiction where by the time they were an adult, they wished to actually purchase someone in the sex trade and act out their porn star fantasy on this person. Whether that person was there legally or illegally, it didn't matter to them. It was their fantasy. And I met a girl in Cambodia. I used to live and work in Cambodia, who told me that Western men would bring their phones and tablets to the brothel where she was being exploited in slavery as a teenager. But to the sex buyer, they don't know who's trafficked and who's not. It's all the kind of the same. It's the sex industry. And they would show her pornography on their devices and get her to copy what she saw. And so we've done a lot of films and documentaries and even campaigns on the intersection between pornography and trafficking. And I do believe that this is part of looking at the deeper upstream root system of demand of human trafficking.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about kind of some of the main things to look out for, because when you talk about people going to another country and they lure these kids in, what are some main ways that you see people doing that? Like, how does that process go that you see is most common?
Yeah. Well, like with even child sexual abuse, the most common perpetrators are not strangers in a hood standing outside a park. It's mostly a family member or a family friend, someone with access to that person. And it's no different with sex trafficking. It's very rare for someone to actually be kidnapped at a gas station.
And that's
or
what people think.
even though that is a lot of the videos that go viral
Yep.
online. And a lot of sex trade survivors and law enforcement consistently are saying, and organizations are saying, this is not what we see. This is not how victims of trafficking are typically captured, because traffickers are smarter than that. They know that if they kidnap a girl or a child, and I'm not saying kidnaps don't happen, but when they do, they're primarily for that person, that perpetrator's own private use. You see them locked in a basement. They're not necessarily being sold to frequent sex buyers. When a pimp or a sex trafficker has the intention of exploiting a woman or child for sex, they know that the most powerful way that they can brainwash them into never running away and obeying their every command is through the psychological grooming process. And so you see that operating in a few different ways. Some pimps operate from the more Romeo pimp scenario. In certain European countries, it's called the lover boy, where they present themselves as a boyfriend. They might even be in what feels like a legitimate relationship for a couple of months until that they have information about that person's family, maybe access to their child, or they've figured out what that person's vulnerabilities are, so that when they switch and tell them that they are to give them $1,000 a night in prostitution, they have significant leverage over them. But you also see some pimps using forces of violence, more like a guerrilla pimp. But it's not just violence against them, it's violence against their family, or the threats of, I will harm your family or your child if you don't go through with this. I read a book by a human trafficker called Pimpology that literally laid out all the psychological, manipulative coercion tactics that he uses. And it included getting a girl pregnant, because then he'd have a constant lifelong control and link to her, and exploiting people with low self-esteem. So typically someone who has been in the foster care system or is a victim of childhood sexual abuse are at the top of the list of vulnerable individuals. Basically, trafficking is the exploitation of vulnerability. And so a trafficker, he won't just make a guess. He will go after someone who he's already identified and targeted what their vulnerabilities are in order to use and exploit that. That's why it's so important that we do educate children, that we educate young people, because even if someone is from a good family and not in the foster care system, they have two good parents. If they are groomed by a trafficker online who's telling them things that maybe no one else is, of how beautiful they are, and is building them up and luring them to eventually meet with them, there's all kinds of intersections like that as well.
So this is mostly done online, correct? For the most part?
What we're seeing is a lot of, in the last few years, a definite increase of grooming online. It doesn't mean to say that that pimps aren't recruiting girls through meeting them at shopping malls
Mm.
or other ways that they just happen to meet, but they don't traffic them then and there. That's where they begin a relationship with them. But sometimes they will recruit. I worked with a survivor, and her trafficker made her friend go through her social media accounts, and he would say, I like the look of that girl, contact her, find out where she's at, set up a meeting. And so these were 18-year-old girls who were being trafficked, but then forced to recruit and groom other girls too, out of their own fear of their life.
And everyone has social media now, and we kind of understand how possible it is for anyone to reach out to you. So I kind of want to talk about things to look for. So if they're going through and they're reaching out, are they doing this through a direct message? Are they then getting their emails? And then what are some things that you find that they say to kind of lure them in?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably other people that would be better targeted to speak into this. I'm not currently, yeah, working with these populations directly.
Okay.
But what we see right now is a lot of the apps that young people are on. So TikTok, Snapchat, literally you can just Google what are the apps that traffickers are most likely to use. And there's several websites that have listed some of them I'd never heard of. They're kind of bizarre names. And even Discord, like recent apps that are highly encrypted that became really popular in the last couple of years. Traffickers, wherever they know that young people are on these groups, they can contact them. And I was asked to speak to a group of second graders, and I asked them, like, who here has had a stranger, or who here even has a smartphone? And about half of the class raised their hands. And I said, who here has ever been contacted by someone they don't know through an app? And at least 5 kids put their hands up. And one of them went and told her teacher afterwards that she has men talking to her all the time on this, and her parents didn't even know about it. So many parents, the average age of kids being given smartphones right now is age 10 years old, and that's actually getting younger. And we're seeing, even with the exposure to pornography at that age getting younger, porn is being used to groom and normalize. We're seeing a lot of peer-on-peer sexual abuse. So even kids who are being just really violently sexually assaulted and exploited, it isn't always adults. It's peers. It's kids between 10 and 15 years old. And where are they getting these ideas from? It's directly from pornography. So as the younger children have access not only to apps and they're in contact with real potential adult abusers, they are seeing violent, degrading sex acts through porn sites and inspired to act that out on other kids. And that's something that isn't being talked about enough at all, but is a reality that I think a lot of parents really need to know.
And I actually read, this is a little bit off topic, but I read about a story of a kid being trafficked at a sporting event. I believe this was a few months ago. It was like she was with her dad and she went to the bathroom. I don't know. Remind me of that story. I'm kind of blanking on the exact details, but I know it was at a game with her father and she went to the bathroom and I guess went missing.
Yeah. Those kind of stories are more rare than you think. And part of me, like, I know they get national spotlight attention, but it sometimes means that people then miss the childhood sexual abuse or the trafficking that's taking place in their own neighborhoods and communities where children are groomed, and families think, oh, like, my friend Uncle Sam, he wouldn't be like trafficking my daughter, like he's not a trafficker. And people need to stop thinking of traffickers as like the bogeyman out there and start being aware that any adult that has access to children and young people is it needs to be vetted, and that most traffickers are talking to your kids online. And so for parents who don't even know who their kids are talking to online, that is what needs to be talked about. And the fact that it's the power disparity between those who are sex buyers and those who are in the sex trade is something that is incredibly important. Men who buy sex, typically married men who have an income of over $100,000 a year. They're from wealthy and middle class, affluent neighborhoods. Not all of them, but this is the most common profile. And the people that are being sold in the sex trade are those from the most vulnerable communities. So from the foster care system, like I mentioned, but also ethnic minorities, indigenous communities, Black and brown communities, and the power dynamic that is taking place every day in prostitution that might not look like the sensational kidnapping of a human trafficking victim, but there is elements of coercion. And I live in Los Angeles. We do street outreach on the street where there are dozens, probably around 80 to 100 girls on any given night, girls with braces on their teeth. I saw one girl with a teddy bear, and the police are driving back and forth and they're not intervening. And laws that have restricted the police making proper prosecutions against sex buyers and pimps means that human trafficking is literally happening in broad daylight in our cities. And I've done outreach in Miami for the Super Bowl, even in Florida where you live, in many cities all across the US. And trafficking, it happens in broad daylight on the streets, and even in strip clubs, on the internet. We developed a texting outreach model of going on websites where people are sold for sex, texting them, asking them if they wanted any assistance, if they wanted resources. We'd meet them in a fast food restaurant and offer them ways to get out. And the vast majority of them entered the sex trade as a teenager, so legally a child, and had a pimp. So there's a big myth out there that people in prostitution are actually consenting sex workers who just love their job. They love having sex with 20 strange men who they have no sexual desire for every day. And that the best thing is to just legalize prostitution, and that will stop sex trafficking. And it sounds shocking, it sounds like ridiculous, but there is a lot of people who've been even brainwashed through even media articles, or people I just meet all the time who say, well, wouldn't legalizing prostitution help reduce trafficking? And that is an absolute myth. There's no data to support that. Women are trafficked into prostitution, and we need better laws to actually prosecute to the full extent of the law pimps, traffickers, third parties, and men who buy women and children for sex. They need to be held accountable. Mm-hmm. Texas is the only state where buying sex is a felony. Everywhere else, it's a misdemeanor. And this is a violent crime. Like we have penalties in place as a deterrent, as well as a punishment that fits the crime. And we need to know that fully decriminalizing prostitution is literally the worst thing that we could do if we want to stop trafficking.
It's interesting why that's even a debate. Like, I mean, in our eyes, it's like, why is this even something that is debated upon? I mean, it's really crazy to me. And you did talk about certain countries that are implementing different laws. So what are those countries, and what are they doing that maybe we need to follow?
So there's currently 8 countries that have passed what I genuinely believe is the most progressive, justice-centered, victim-centered approach. Sweden was the first country that passed this 23 years ago. I actually spent the summer there last year researching this policy. I really wanted to go there and meet with organizations, the government, law enforcement, survivors, hear up close, like, how has this law impacted? And basically, the law that began, it was called the Swedish model or the Nordic model. Here in the US, it's been called the equality model, because basically its desire is to achieve equality between men and women, and it criminalizes to the full extent of the law sex buying. There's a sliding scale fine, but it's a heavy criminal penalty. It's seen as a human rights violation to purchase the sexual consent of a vulnerable person. And then traffickers and pimps and third parties are criminalized. You can't run a brothel. And if you're visiting as a sex tourist, you will get arrested and deported. And then it decriminalizes prostitution for people in it. It says that they shouldn't be arrested and sent to jail. Like in most cases, they're more akin to a domestic violence victim who's being exploited through trafficking or because of survival. They should be offered exit services and programs and housing if they want to take that. So that model passed in 1999. It reduced demand significantly in Sweden, and it's shrunk the sex industry to absolute minimum. And it's a real value in Sweden to have enthusiastic mutual sexual consent as part of gender equality. It's consistently voted one of the most pro-gender equality countries in the world. And so then after they passed it, Norway and Iceland followed suit. And then more recently, France, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Canada, and Israel have also passed this law. And there's various states here within the US that are looking at passing it, from Massachusetts, New York, and I really believe that in the next few years, if more states within the US adopted this law, we would see a significant decline in the sex trade. It would shrink it rather than increase it. And therefore, that shrinks the supply of trafficked girls and women rather than increases it. Because where you have a society where women and children are for sale for sex, and that's normalized. I was also in Amsterdam and Germany last summer, right after Sweden, where I saw women being sold in the windows. And there's families walking around the red light district because it's this historical cultural epicenter. It's promoted in their tourist magazines. I did outreach with a
Wow.
local shopping center there. We gave out roses to every woman behind the window. The majority of women there, they're not from the Netherlands, they're not Dutch, they're from some of the poorest Eastern European countries. There's links with organized crime. We've interviewed trafficking victims who were sold behind the windows. And to me, it just felt like such a slap in the face as a woman to see women like a blow up mannequin sex doll for rent behind a window. Like that absolutely has to change. And in Germany, these are countries that legalize prostitution and normalize the purchase of sex. There's brothels with 200 women being sold in it. There were these individual cubicles on the street with a government sign saying this could be used as a public toilet or for sex in prostitution. I would open the door. I got film footage of this. There was bloodied rags, needles, condoms. Like this is what a normalized red light district looks like. And we saw gangs trafficking girls on the streets. But this is happening in America as well. We really don't want to see law enforcement's hands tied to not be able to arrest buyers and traffickers. And there's some amazing people in law enforcement who care deeply about this issue, who are doing stings regularly, and we want to be able to see more support and more funding for that. But not arresting the women, we're never for that. They should not be criminalized in any way, even if they've chosen it from a place of I'm a single mother. I literally feel I have no choice but to sell my body. Even that situation, I feel like we're failing women as a society if we say your only option to get through college is to go be prostituted on the street, or your only way to feed your kids. Like society needs to offer better support to vulnerable women across the board.
No, I totally agree. And I think that sometimes it's glorified. I think that we see and whether or not they choose to go in it, but we see porn stars on social media and we see OnlyFans people. I know that some of these people do want to do it, but it's being glorified in certain ways. And it's hard because I don't think that porn in general will go away ever. Mm-hmm. But I guess the question is kind of like, I guess you're getting people who choose to do that and taking away from the people that are brought into it at a young age and don't really want to be there. So it's kind of like, how do you, because it seems like the root thing of porn will not go away, but how do we get rid of the extras? Yeah, so I think it's just raising awareness and voting and kind of getting new laws in place here.
I think when it comes to porn, it's we began a campaign a few years ago that became this global movement called Trafficking Hub that raised awareness that even some of the biggest porn sites, they didn't even verify age or consent on any of their videos. And so the New York Times in 2020 reached out to us, and by that time we'd already done a viral petition and video, and we were saying there are videos of real human trafficking and rape victims on all these porn sites, and they can't even get the porn sites to take down these videos. Wow. 13-year-old, 14-year-olds who were coming to us, and it had ruined their life. And the Sunday Times in the UK actually did an investigation on Pornhub, found videos of kids as young as 3 years old on Pornhub. So this in 2020 exploded as wait a second, people are watching porn, but they're actually watching real videos of trafficking victims and creating a demand for that. Pornhub ended up deleting 80% of their entire website, 10 million videos, after MasterCard and Visa cut ties with them. And they blamed us in their statement. We saw it as a great victory. But now we're proposing laws be changed because the porn industry is actually very unregulated and has managed successfully to push back on a lot of regulation. So right now, kids can access hardcore violent pornography. There's no government ID restricting them to actually prove they're 18. And we're seeing different countries wake up to this. Like France, literally a few weeks ago, just required a government ID, like porn pass, to access any porn site. You have to put in a form of government ID. Okay. And Canada, Australia, the UK are also looking at this. So we want to protect kids from under 18 from being able to access porn. And we want to make sure every porn site verifies the age and consent. So these seem like two minimum regulations. Like it's the wild, wild west out there. And the porn industry, like so many other facets of the internet, has really exploded over the last few years. It's basically this multi-billion industry that needs accountability. So we found ourselves in kind of a bit of a watchdog position, calling for some of these regulations. And I think we're at a position with porn now where we were with the tobacco industry 30 years ago, of recognizing actually this causes harm, particularly to children. We need to make sure that there's the rightful warnings and awareness and protection from children, and just regulations to, like, we don't want cancer in our society. We don't want people smoking, and we're not going to criminalize people who make that choice or make harmful choices. But we want to, like, the information and stories that we're hearing from children who were exposed to porn, from how porn is impacting relationships and marriages, how it's impacting the mental health of young people, how it's used as a form of blackmail with sextortion, and people are being literally coerced into all forms of the porn industry. So there just needs to be a lot of regulations, and that's what we're supporting. We have a bunch of documentaries and even petitions on all of this on our website, exoduscry.com. So I really encourage people to get aware, because it's a pretty terrifying thought that you could be watching videos of an underage trafficked person in porn, but that's happening every day.
It's just awful to think about, and it's kind of mind-blowing and shocking that there aren't better laws in place already after all this time. I mean, it's just crazy. I know a lot of websites, they require you to upload a picture of your ID and to verify your age. There's a lot of different ways we can do this, and you're right, I didn't even think about a lot of these websites don't have that. So I think there are a lot of ways to kind of put regulations on it that are super important, and that way at least it's minimized to what you're watching, and that way even if kids are looking it up at a young age, they aren't seeing the harsh reality of something that could be really destructive for someone else. So what are some things that we can do aside from signing the petition, which I will love to do after we get off of this, but what are some things that we can do today just for the people that are listening?
Yeah, I always feel like the most helpful starting point for anyone is just to get a little bit better educated, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. And on our website, we have tons of resources and information. We've made 5 documentaries. One of them was bought by Netflix. Some of them are on YouTube, so they're all free. And we have a whole list of all our films. We made one documentary about the global sex trafficking, sex trade. And then we have another film on sex trafficking and human rights violations in the porn industry, that we've just released the 2nd episode of recently, and that series is called Beyond Fantasy. So again, exoduscry.com lists out all our films, sends all the links to that. And we have a couple of different petitions going on for different things that people can support. So just making yourself aware, just spend 5 minutes reading through our website. You'll get a lot of knowledge and insight, I can guarantee. Our handle is at Exodus Cry on Instagram, and we have a lot of really powerful content and videos. We're on TikTok as well, and Twitter and YouTube. But I think just intentionally even connecting to an organization that is like educating the public about these things, that's the first step. A lot of people don't even want to know, would prefer to just go on with their day-to-day lives, not even thinking about this. And I really get it. I know that this is one of the most tough social issues of our time. But I really want to challenge people that it's too important for you to turn away. Like, we need the public to know what laws need to be passed. We need the public to know what's really happening in our communities, how to protect yourself and others. So I really encourage people to track with our work and get connected.
I completely agree. And I think just even listening to you talk is kind of, you kind of raise awareness even to me. I'm like, wow, I didn't realize some of these things. So I think watching those documentaries would help. And I'll go ahead and link them below for anyone that wants to watch those. And we'll make sure you have the links accessible. So, well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed it. And where can they find you if they want to keep up to date with you?
Sure. I mean, I'm linked on the Exodus Cry Instagram, so they can find me. I don't. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Exodus Cry.
Yeah.
We post a ton on that.
All the info on there. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this episode.
You too. Thanks so much for having me, Annie.